All right, now we're live. Now we're going to say play for all. Hey, everybody. Nice to see you all. We're super excited to have you all here. A bunch of you have obviously started playing around and participating in the Do Now, which is great. So if we can all start typing some of the pieces of evidence that you might be able to see in an MIT classroom that would be evidence of these how student learn principles in action. Engaging prior understandings, factual knowledge and conceptual frameworks, metacognition. Go ahead and post each of those as Emily and Matteo have started doing. And we'll just keep doing this as people kind of make their way into the room. Hopefully you're all able to see the video. One of the kind of funny things about the video is that we're at a few seconds removed from where you are. You're watching us about in a 60-second delay, so sometimes that might make our interactions seem a little staggered, but that's okay. So you'll be able to look at my beautiful visage for a little while, and we can just keep working on the Do Now. And I'll probably continue to remind people about the Do Now as folks are coming in. Welcome to all of you who are just joining with us now. Hopefully you can see me talking up here in the top left corner of your screen. And as you can see, a bunch of folks have logged in. And what we're trying to do now is a Do Now, which we'll do for the next few minutes, is to share in the chat window evidence of what we might be able to observe in an MIT classroom that would show the principles from how students learn in action, engaging prior understanding, factual knowledge and conceptual frameworks, and metacognition. So trying to be as specific as possible, not just sort of which classes are good at this thing, but what exactly could you see in that class, in either sitting in a classroom session or looking through the materials, what very specifically would give you evidence that one of these kinds of things that you're describing is happening? Well, this is great. Thanks so much to you all for making it here on time. Let's spend a few more minutes chatting here in the in the chat window and let people continue to get some ideas out there. And then maybe in a few minutes, Wendy can give us her sort of overview, and I can jump in and help on kind of what we're seeing here and what kinds of themes are emerging and so forth. Great, good. Wendy, do you want to pull together some thoughts here? Maybe I'll jump in.
Trying to. There's a lot to read. So yeah, this is a very interesting format for, I guess, trying to. I guess it's going to take me a little bit longer to figure out what some of these themes are. But I guess I was struck by, I think it was something that Drew wrote. I'm trying to find it right now. But where he mentioned a class that taught Maxwell's equations, and where it was sort of posted throughout the class, and then they kept adding to it as they learned more. So I thought that was interesting, and he used that as a way to illustrate the relationship between facts and concepts. And so I thought that was a really good example of that as a piece of evidence. And then I guess I'm trying to figure out a good one for, well, a lot of people mention prior knowledge, and as like sort of the professors assuming that they've learned some other stuff that they should have. But I guess I wonder, more about, what would that look like in the class? Like, how would the professor actually, what would they actually do or say that would be evidence that they assume that? I guess that's what I'd be wondering more about for the people.
And it might be useful to make a distinction between assuming prior understanding and engaging prior understanding.
Right.
So I think as the cognitive scientists are describing that, obviously every instructor has to assume that people know something, know language, know how to use their eyeballs, how to, do basic things or more complicated things. But to me, the critical question is in what ways are people engaging those prior understandings? I think it was Richard who made an observation about a class where they asked people to, in the social theory and practice class, give our conceptions of what define race and what key racial differences are. So it's not just assuming that people have an understanding of race, which we all do, but it's actually sort of directly engaging those prior understandings and teasing some of those things out. There was another one that was great in here that I thought of going through and engaging incorrect prior understandings, going through some proofs or some, this often happens in science where when you're younger you get taught a sort of not exactly correct way of understanding it, which is more conceptually clear, or at least conceptually easier for younger people to grab, and then some later, instructor has to say, remember how we told you that this was true? Actually, it doesn't quite work like that because our model doesn't include these 4 components. And going back to that. So that was, I think, that would be a good example of trying to, so the idea of engaging prior understandings is not just assuming prior understandings, but really trying to wrestle with those prior understandings. But any other themes that struck you, Wendy?
I guess the thing with meta, I feel like there might be still some confusion around what that is. Like people gave a lot of examples of kind of, like thinking about how to apply knowledge, for example, and they say that's an example of meta. I guess I haven't really seen any. I don't know. I can't read that fast, but Justin, did you see any examples in the students' chat about that would be a good example of metacognition?
Well, so I would say the ones in which, Maha's recent comment in 601, you have to explain to TAs how you thought about the problem, why you thought about the problem, and ask you if you could have done it differently. That, I think, sort of starts getting more and more into meta. Actually, I was looking around at sort of different resources for metacognition, and I actually think the Wikipedia page is pretty good in summarizing. The key part of metacognition, and some of this came up in our conversation about video games, is it's not just the act of thinking; it's being strategic. Sometimes a word you might use is planful about thinking. So to what extent are you, monitoring is another word that gets in there. To what extent are you asking people to say, okay, are you conscientious of the thinking strategy that you're using in this moment, and the fact that you've selected that thinking strategy, and the fact that you might have 2 or 3 other thinking strategies that you could have selected in this particular moment. I find the word strategy there very helpful, and so I would say some of the ones where you're just being asked to reflect on what you did. That might not actually get into this idea of metacognition. I mean, it can be sort of a starting point for that, but ultimately metacognition really is about having people not only reflect, but sort of have an ongoing monitoring of the strategies that they're using to solve problems and being thoughtful about, okay, which of a set of problems am I going to use to be able to do that. And then the other one, one of the things that that comes up in here is I think people are making a lot of assertions about classes as a whole. That's sort of the nature of the class. This is sort of how the class operates, and I think making those assertions is great. In order to make those assertions in really compelling ways, we want to be able to provide very, very specific evidence of something. So you might say, well, this class promotes metacognition by these sorts of general practices. Even better to be able to say, and here's one particular instance in which this happens in a particularly powerful way. Here's one specific way that you can really see students are being stopped in what they're doing and taught how to strategize, or that the class keeps a sort of running list of proof strategies on a board or other kinds of strategies on a board and so forth. And so I think that's when somebody at Ruth asked me the question about sort of what I mean by seeing, it's that we want to make sure that we're not just talking sort of overall about how a class operates, but very, very specifically about something that you can see. Drew's comment here that meta is hard to find in classes because it's more of an internal thought process, I think that's a great observation. That most of our metacognition does happen inside our heads, and what we're looking for is examples where faculty try to get us to make those strategies explicit. Uniza's question of would choosing existing algorithms to tackle a new problem be meta, that sounds to me like it very well could have. If you, particularly if you could say, like, as programmers, we have a bank of algorithms that we can turn to. What kind of problem are you looking at, and which sort of which sort of toolbox seems like it's the right fit for that, and why? That's definitely getting at some of those ideas of metacognition. Good. Other questions? Other thoughts? Wendy, do you have any other things that are there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would still wonder about what would the difference be between metacognition and just applying knowledge, right? It seems like there should be a difference, but I'm not sure what that is.
Yeah, I think the distinction is there are all kinds of circumstances where we apply knowledge. Reading is actually a really good example of this. So very few proficient readers are particularly metacognitive when they read. Most people just grab a book and kind of plug it all along and read things, and actually for really good fluent readers, it just sort of makes sense to them. For novice readers, we actually have to stop and say, here are some things that good readers do that they might not even realize they're doing that make them better readers. So good readers ask questions as they go along. Good readers visualize when they get confused. Good readers make predictions about what's going to happen later on in a text. Good readers know when to skim and move ahead when they get confused, and know when to slow down and really, really closely to try to understand things. For one of the things that's been sort of a big trend in reading instruction over the past 20 years is to try to say, what are all the things that good readers do well? How can we label those things and describe them to struggling readers? And then ask them to be intentional about applying those strategies. I think it's when you're sort of monitoring, someone who's sort of reading more metacognitively when they ran into something that they didn't understand, they would start asking questions like, why didn't I understand this, and what would be some different things that I could try to help them understand it. As opposed to like almost all, I bet nearly everyone in our class is a really fluent reader. When they get stuck on things, they just sort of figure out how to do it without really breaking down strategies.
So like in a classroom, if a teacher asks students to correct their mistakes on a test, would that be an example of metacognition?
So I think if you saw students just like going through and correcting answers, it wouldn't necessarily be metacognition. I mean, especially if what they were finding, if you were looking at a math test or a computer programming test, and people were just sort of going through code and being like, oh, I dropped a colon there, that's why it didn't work. Then that, I think, is less metacognitive. Some of the comments that people have made where they're saying, I had a professor or a TA who made me look at my mistake and then look at the kinds of, the reasons why I made that mistake and the kinds of problems that would be in that mistake. And then think about different strategies that I could use to not make that mistake again. This point about language, I think, gets at some of that that Veronica makes. Correcting the incorrect use of language while making them figure out why they made that specific mistake. Was that mistake because they they mistranslated an idiom, or because they were in the wrong tense, or other kinds of things. So it's strategy. To me, the word that sort of unlocks metacognition is strategy. That you're being intentional about the kinds of things that you're thinking. Cool.
Okay. Great.
Why don't so how about for the next chunk of time, Wendy, do you want to help us go through an introduction to understanding by design, and we'll do that for a little while, and then we'll move on to thinking about current events.
Okay, that sounds great. All right, so I'm going to just put in the the chat window like a link to my slides, so you guys can sort of, well, I guess Justin, you said there's a way for me to also just project it, right?
So I can, if you just tell me to, if you tell me what slide you want to be on.
Sure. Next. Okay, there we go. Okay. So these are just some basic terms. Okay, great. That I thought we should be familiar with and be on the same page about. And I got these just directly from the book Understanding by Design. So for curriculum, I like how they said that the etymology of that word is a course to run. So given a desired endpoint. So it assumes that you have some set of like some goals that you're aiming towards, and the curriculum is the blueprint for learning. What based on kind of your content and performance standards, and it also introduces the idea of sequencing as well. So it's not just here's a blueprint, but also the order that you need to learn these things in order to get to some desired endpoint. So another way to think about it is it's not just a syllabus of topics and materials, but specifies how the activities and the assignments and the assessments are used to achieve the learning goals. And then for assessment, and we're going to dive more into this a little bit later on, but just for now, assessment is the act of determining the extent to which the goals were met. And an important point that the authors make is that it's important to assess in multiple ways in order to get a fair and a balanced view of what the student. Understanding is a continuum, and developing that continuum in very specific language is an important part of developing useful assessments. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are the 3 basic stages in the backward design process. identifying desired results, determining acceptable evidence, and then planning the learning experiences and instruction. Now, it seems like really sort of obvious, but yet, there's so much instruction that really isn't planned like this. So, in fact, most teachers, including myself,
Oh, Wendy, we lost your sound again.
isn't very good. So, which part should I start from?
From you go through that slide again.
Okay. Well, these are basically the 3 stages in the backward design process. And it may seem sort of very obvious that these should be the stages that we go through, starting with identifying the desired results, then determining evidence, and then planning the learning experiences. But for a lot of teachers, this is actually not how we naturally think. So next slide. Okay, so in fact, most teachers actually think more like this. We are asking ourselves these questions. We're thinking, oh, what would be interesting and engaging activities to do for this topic, or what are the resources that are out there on this topic? What should students be doing? What assignments am I going to give? How am I going to give students a grade? And then, later on, we might reflect and say, well, did the activities work? Why or why not? So I would argue that a lot of teachers actually these are the questions that we're thinking about. But this is kind of how the authors want to kind of push more teachers to think, thinking like an assessor. So rather than just thinking about what are
You dropped again.
Okay, so I guess you guys can just read the questions here on the right, and the question that I guess I would ask people to think about is, is just to note the contrast. Like, what difference do you think it would make for a teacher to think more like an assessor rather than just as an activity designer? And what might be preventing a teacher from thinking more like an assessor than an activity designer? I hope that went through.
Yeah, most of it.
Okay. Okay, so Raul has a question. Is it bad that activity designers doesn't think that way? So I guess, what do you guys think? Like, is it, what difference do you think it makes for a teacher to think one way or to think the other way? And Lena commented that it's hard to think like an assessor. What about concepts that can't be assessed? Okay, some interesting comments there. And then following that, then the activities are designed last so that they can align to the first 2 things. Hmm. Okay. All right. Well, it seems like the comments have slowed down a bit. Let's see. What are some? All right. Um, yeah. I guess I guess we can move on to the next slide.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so as you know, the two essential questions of our course is what's worth learning, and how do we know students are learning? And so the way that kind of understanding by design tries to answer these two questions is, well, to the first one in particular, they give you 4 design criteria to determine what's worth learning, and those are. To what extent does an idea represent a big idea? So, in other words, how enduring, does it have enduring value beyond the classroom? And for me, an example of this for me was in 5th grade, reading the book Animal Farm. And then the big idea there from that book was that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I find myself still, using this big idea like throughout my lifetime, as I think about things are happening in the world, or understanding, politics, or, relationships within organizations. So that was, a big idea that had enduring value, and I learned that in school from reading this book. The second thing there is how much to what extent does the idea reside at the heart of a discipline. So for example, as I'm teaching, the big ideas I focus on is abstraction and algorithms. As I really feel like these two ideas get at the heart of computer science, and I really want my students to, to sort of tackle these ideas and sort of understand it from different perspectives. And because I know that if they continue with computer science, having these big ideas will really help them to advance to, further in that study. And then the third one is sort of to what extent does this idea require on coverage. So this is where, maybe there are some misconceptions that need to be addressed in order to, to sort of get at what's important there. So an example that I remember seeing from is where this, I guess this researcher interviewed some college students and asked them, where does a mass come from in a tree trunk? They give them a piece of a tree and say, where does this mass come from? And then students, came up with all kinds of ideas, like, well, maybe it's from, the water, or, or, from the soil, or, and so it's really interesting to realize that, yeah, these college students who surely have learned, I mean, in fact, a lot of them probably learned about photosynthesis back in like middle school. Somehow it couldn't make the connection, right, between that process and sort of this object. And then the final thing there is to what extent is the idea engaging for students. So an example that the book gives is is what does it mean to be independent? And that might relate to topics in social studies like the Revolutionary War, but it could also represent something that adolescents are engaged in themselves personally. Um, so, I mean, some questions to discuss maybe on in the chat box might be, what have been some things that you've learned that have fit at least one of these categories? Or the second question is, if you think about the MIT class that you're planning to observe, would you say that you have attained understanding of what that class was intending to teach? Do you still have that understanding? What has endured and what has just sort of left your brain, right, at the end of the course, after the class finished? So thinking about, so if people want to maybe take some time to answer one or two of these questions. Okay.
And remember, people are about a minute behind in the chat window, so.
Okay.
Good. So hopefully the video have caught up here, and yeah, we can start getting some people sharing some of their instincts. I really like abstraction and algorithms as some of the central pieces of computer science. That's there. There are a lot of fields that I don't know very much about, so it's actually fun to try to learn. Sort of what are those key messages? This one Nishal is mentioning about 6005, things come back to easy to understand, safe from bugs, and ready for change. Like those seem like great kind of enduring understanding. That's great, Katie, to be able to also find some courses that maybe don't fit these categories so well. That if there are courses that seem like the material is disjointed and disparate from the heart of a discipline, that's really helpful to be able to see some contrary examples. So, so this comment that Drew makes here about I felt like the reason I forgot things was the class wasn't built with retention in mind. I mean, that to me is sort of a great comment for this whole discussion of understanding by design. That ultimately what we're that a big part of Wiggins and Mateague's argument is that learning environments can be designed, and they should be designed to a particular set of outcomes. And it's not just each of those daily activities that should be created so that students have something to do, but that we're trying to draw connections across all the different things that happen from day to day so that those experiences build up into larger components.
On to talking about assessments, which is perfect because that's our next slide. So I guess we can move on to the next one.
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, so how do we know that students are learning? So Wiggins-McTighe has a lot to say about this, and I picked out kind of 3 things that I thought were very interesting. So one thing is they talk a lot about understanding as a continuum. And sort of degrees of understanding. So from more naive to more sophisticated understanding, from simplistic to complex. So as opposed to just saying something is right or wrong. So, for example, you know, a sophisticated and then other ways that people might be able to demonstrate that they have a sophisticated level of understanding is if they can teach a concept, use it, prove it, explain it, defend it, or like read between the lines. And so, you know, so I thought those were some really, really important points that they had. And then the next thing about assessments. Oh, and sorry, and a little bit more on the first one. And that's why I think we design rubrics, you know, to assess people's level of understanding. So, you know, such as the rubric that you guys, you know, sort of co-constructed for paper number 1. So thinking about, you know, what are these different levels of understanding that can be demonstrated through writing this paper and analyzing The author talked a little bit more, and we're going to talk more about this too as we talk about standardized testing, but the idea of assessments needing to be valid, reliable, and sufficient. So valid meaning that the evidence will let us draw accurate inferences about specific student understandings, and that's not muddied by other variables. Reliable meaning that the evidence gives us confidence where we can actually see a pattern that gives us a picture of the student's true abilities. And then sufficient in diversity and quantity. So it means that, you know, sampling just once or sampling in just one format isn't enough. And like I said, we'll talk a little bit more. Insight. And I personally experienced this in my high school freshman year. And it's this idea that, you know, sort of the quality of the idea versus the quality of the performance. So someone may have like a really beautiful, you know, insightful idea, but it may be obscured by their performance. So they may have difficulty expressing that idea either orally or in writing. So the authors describe it as sophisticated understanding lurking beneath weakly executed performances. And like I said, I personally experienced this as a high school freshman. And when in my freshman English class, I wrote a paper, my first paper in that class, got it back and got a C on it. And I was like shocked. And but then my teacher said, "Oh, come see me after class." So I did, and he said, "You know, you have some really great ideas, but your grammar is terrible. And so here's some worksheets. We're gonna help you work on, getting your, subject and verb to agree. You know, work on your tense." And it was just, I just really, I was so like kind of moved that he was able to, sort of see, like, see past, I guess, the grammar problems to, say you have some really good ideas. We just really need to work on the execution of it. So that was really neat. Anyway, that was just a personal experience of that. So I guess here are some questions for us to discuss. So, have you ever gotten a high grade in a class, but you know that deep down inside, like, or feel like? And then the third thing, what have been some really well-designed assessments you've taken? So those are some questions for us to think about. Oh, and then related to the problem of insight, sorry, I forgot to mention this, but I think what's interesting there is sort of how can we design assessments that sort of separate out, the insights from the performance? Is that possible? Can we recognize someone for a good idea that they have, even if their performance isn't, particularly great, And so in math, for example, it might be that they have some really good ideas for how to do a math proof, but maybe the execution, maybe the reasoning, maybe the way they present their ideas wasn't particularly good. So so just thinking about how can we separate out insight from the performance.
So Wendy, I would suggest that by maybe 12:30, we probably ought to be moving on to the current events piece.
Okay, that sounds good. We can. Okay, sure. All right. So next slide. All right. Okay, so I think everyone, the rubric looks mostly done, right? So I just put a question there to help us think about, does it separate insight from presentation? Just threw that in there. I don't know. I'm pulling up the rubric now. Oh, looks mostly done. Oh, it looks essay. Okay, I guess I don't have too much to say about this. It was just something that I thought would be is a sort of a connection since we are in the process of making rubric. To think about, you know. Yeah, go ahead.
About the rubric. So thanks everyone who has populated most of it. It looks like the thesis group, the paragraph structure group have these idiosyncratic pieces missing, and then the essay organization group need to get themselves organized and put their section in there. Let's do this. I want to, as much as possible, use most of the material that's written in here. But I'm also really open to having people give feedback on other parts of this. So this is the the rubric that we've co-created is what I'm going to use to give you feedback and to holistically assess your essays. So if there are things here that you think are really important that are missing, or things that you particularly think we ought to discuss or talk about, feel free to drop a comment into any of these sections by doing insert comment. And sometime soon I'll take one pass through this whole thing, and maybe I might do a little bit to shorten it or some other kinds of things like that. But why don't we give you all until the end of the week to provide some additional feedback, and then I'll try either by the end of the week or over the weekend to pull things together, and then hopefully by Sunday we'll sort of lock it in. But there's obviously a lot of good thought that went into here, and a lot of good reflections from the conversation that we had together. And it's I think a great question to ask at this point too, as an overview, is if we use this rubric, is this going to be a useful tool in gathering evidence about whether or not your understanding of all the goals that we have in this class, of being able to communicate more clearly, being able to understand what's worth learning, and whether or not students are learning or being met by essays that perform well on this rubric. Good, so more to follow there.
Okay, great. All right, I think this is your part, Justin.
Okay, I want to share with you one of my very favorite, let me see if I can blow this up a little bit. So here's another example. No, I want you to be really big. So this is just my favorite example of, and it'll probably be a little bit hard to see, but I'll pass another version of it along to you, or if you click on it, it actually becomes a video. So this is one of my favorite examples of what beautiful backwards design looked like when it finished. So this is an intermediate statistics class at the Harvard's Graduate School of Education, where the entire semester-long syllabus in the class can be summarized into a single slide. And the core competency that this class is trying to develop is to have students conduct and responsibly analyze multiple regression frameworks. So taking a whole pile of data and finding out what correlations there are among those data. And the way the class is broken down is it basically starts with this sort of stylized multiple regression equation, and then for each part of the equation, it asks a series of questions. Is your outcome categorical? or is it continuous? If it is categorical, what kinds of logistic regression models would you need to use? When you have predictors, what kinds of predictors do you have? How many of them you have? If you have with your residuals, what kinds of errors are there? If you have these particular kinds of errors, how will you resolve those kinds of errors? And so every day in class, class begins by going back to this same slide. So there are 2 classes a week every week, so whatever it is, 30 classes. The first thing you show is this slide, and a circle on that slide that says, okay, today we're here. Here's the concept that you should be understanding, how it builds towards this larger set of ideas. Each of the assessments are sort of like roughly paired with those colored groups that you see. And so it's sort of, do you conceptually understand this color group? Can we assess that? And then ultimately, does it help you understand this larger multiple regression analysis? I was one year when I was preparing for this class, I had gone to the Institute of Contemporary Art with an artist, and had a super fun time going to the museum with this artist, because he could just see in it so many things that I wasn't capable of seeing. Things were sort of more beautiful to him because he had a rich understanding. I sort of feel like if he and I were sitting and looking at this slide, he would have the same experience here, which is, for me, something like this is incredibly beautiful. The idea that a whole course could be engineered such that a clear presentation of the entire framework of the course could be baked into one slide, which could provide an anchor to the course, a map to the course throughout the whole thing. To me, that's just a really beautiful piece of design. And so I think, as you're going through the materials that you look at and the evidence that you're trying to gather, these might be pieces that you could be able to look at. When you look at pieces from a syllabus or particular slides that are out there, what kind of evidence can you gather from that particular artifact to give you a better sense of how a teacher, how well a professor's teaching aligns with some of these key principles? Wendy, do you want to sum up
okay.
final pieces, and then we'll break up into groups?
Sure. Okay. So I guess so this is the slide again with the 3 stages in the backward design process. So even though there is a sort of suggested sort of process, right? You start with identifying the desired results. Then you determine the assessments, and then you plan. But we do want to emphasize that it's not a linear process, but it is an iterative process. And so oftentimes you would, the entry points might be different. So a teacher might want to start with a very engaging activity, and then sort of build in these other pieces as their design. End of this, okay, the unit that you design should look backward. That it was backward designed. I think that's a point that we wanted to make about this.
Yeah, that's great. I think that really is the sort of essential piece to it, is that a lot of what Wiggins and Mattigue are proposing is that when a curriculum, when a unit is finished, it should look like it's backwards designed. It should look like someone from the beginning thought about the results and then determined acceptable evidence and then planned learning experiences and instruction. And definitely in reality, it doesn't always work that way. And in part, it doesn't always work that way because different kinds of factors impose upon you. So a biology teacher will either, they might have the state say, okay, these are certain desired results that you absolutely have to have. But then they may have their own desired results, or they may have activities which they've just found are so fun and tap into the things that they care about and love the most that you end up sort of adjusting your desired results to make room for particular kinds of activity. But I think what Wiggins and Mattigue would say is when you go into really well-designed courses, you can point to sort of any moment in that course and say, all right, what are the experiences that we're having right here, and how is that preparing people for assessments, and how are those assessments preparing evidence that students are learning the things that are most important to learn. So hopefully that's a useful overview of Understanding by Design. We'll keep coming back to this book and reading different parts of it because I think it's a helpful blueprint. I've found over the years that one of the great things about working with this book with MIT students is that in so many of your other classes, you're designers and engineers and thinking about how systems are created. And I think that systems thinking mentality will serve you well here when thinking about the design of learning environments. We're going to take about 15 more minutes for class, and here's how I want those last 15 minutes to go. So one of the cool things about on Hangout, it let us broadcast this message, it let us have a little chat room, but we can actually break you up into smaller rooms to have discussions with each other. And so I want to now break you up into 3 rooms, and I'll ask Matteo to go in the first room, and Emily to go in the second room, and Wendy to go in the third room to facilitate conversations there. Let me open the sessions for you. And basically what you should see now is this little join button which popped up on the left. When you click on that button and join into it, you should find yourself in a Hangout on air with 7 or 8 other folks. Hopefully you can distribute yourself equitably across those rooms. And Matteo and Wendy and Emily will do their best to facilitate a conversation among you. None of them have ever used this before, and so who knows if there'll be all kinds of problems or other kinds of things, but I suspect it'll work reasonably well. And so just take about 15 minutes in these small groups to converse with each other about the current events and about some of these ideas from WTF Math and what we can learn from that. And then at the end of those 15 minutes, you keep talking as long as you want to, but do it for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then class will be closed. We won't have any kind of final summative thing together to do. So let's fire away, have some people jump into all of those sessions, try to equitably distribute yourselves, and have a good chat with one another about the current events.